Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about photography and my journey through photography. I've been asked a few times recently to go and talk at photography seminars where everyone is kind of nerdy photographers, want to talk about f-stops and lenses and all that kind of stuff that, I'll be honest, really bores me. The reason I don't really tend to do those kind of talks is I think photography is kind of simple. Somebody was recently asking me, they have a kid that's sort of getting into photography, and they're like, what advice can you do? What can I do to help them learn about photography? Should they go and study it? And I said, to be honest, photography is really simple. You just have to point the camera in the right direction and press a button. But it took me 40 years to work out which direction to point the camera. And that's the hard bit. So what I'm going to talk a bit about today is how I learned to point my camera in the right direction. I was about 18 when I had a car accident in the States. I was quite badly injured. This is obviously quite a trend in my life. I ended up in hospital over here. At that time, I was supposed to be doing sport in the States. I wasn't very good at it, but I had a dream that that's what I was going to do. And I found myself suddenly in a hospital bed in the UK going, bollocks. I had kind of failed all my exams because, well, I say failed. I decided I was never going to open my A-level results. To this day, they remained sealed. And I was thinking, what the fuck am I going to do with my life? And then, I was going to say fortunately, but unfortunately, my godfather died. And he left me two things. He left me his little Olympus OM10 camera and a book by the war photographer Don McCullum. And I lay in a hospital bed and read this book and was absolutely gobsmacked by it. I grew up in a household that really wasn't into art or the media, so I'd never really been confronted with photography and the power of it. And reading about the work he did in Vietnam, in Africa, in Bangladesh, I was just, wow, this is what I wanted to do. And so I lay in the hospital bed with my little Olympus OM10 and practiced on all the nurses coming in. They got a bit sick of it, because every time they'd come in to do anything, I'd be like, no, stay there, stay there. I'm trying to learn how to focus, I'm trying to... And that's how I taught myself photography. As I say, it's relatively simple. So I left hospital, decided I'm going to be a photographer now. But I really had no idea what anything, the industry worked or how you do it. So I naively, with a couple of pictures of friends, went up to a couple of magazines in London, persuaded them to see me. I remember the look of slight confusion on one magazine editor's face when I kind of blagged about how I used to work in America, and I did this and did that. And then I walked in, and I was a bit of a hippie then. I had like dungarees on and really long hair, and a couple of like pictures in a little paper folder. Showed it to him. He looked at me and goes, "You seem to take good pictures, but could you work under pressure?" And a couple of people had said this to me, and I was like, "Can't see why not." So I went home and thought, well, what shall I do? So I decided to go to Cuba. It was just a country that had always interested me. It was still cut off to Westerners at the time. I naively thought they would let me in. So I managed to sort out some transport working with the Cuban Arts Fund and headed off to Cuba. And I should say how, well, I'm not sure if it's bloody-minded, stupid, or naive I was, that even my camera bag, I decided I would do it my own way. So I got a big box, a big wooden box, and made that into a camera bag. It was so heavy, and so suddenly there was this weird British guy just walking around Cuba with this huge, great sort of wooden box, stopping people in the street to take their photographs. I was arrested on a few occasions. I had the naivety once to photograph somebody who was in the Cuban equivalent of the KGB, who was running a brothel. I thought, well, he won't mind me taking his photograph. And he was stood on the balcony, and I kind of got on the balcony opposite, waved at him, he waved back, and I took his photograph. As I was going out at the back, suddenly this car pulls up, and got a policeman get out, point a gun at me. I'm like, do they want their photo as well? So this is one of the first pictures that I did, and I was working in a very simple way because I didn't know how to do anything really photographically apart from put my camera on a tripod, which again I'd made myself, and I would just get people to stand there. And I used to say, well, I'm photographing the act of somebody being photographed. And so that's how I started out. And I traveled around Cuba, taking photographs of Anybody I met, really. And I did that for a couple of months. It was a fantastic experience. And I came back and then showed my work to a few magazines and said, this is what I do now. Can I have a job? And they're like, well, what do you want to do with your photography? And documentary, go off and do this. And they're like, well, you've come to a music magazine. Okay, I'll do music. So I ended up photographing bands, started getting into fashion, and I have to say I loved it. Traveled around the world photographing all these kind of cool people. But I remember I was about 19, and one of my aunts sitting around at Christmas, she goes, well, I thought you wanted to do serious documentary photography. Maybe. She goes, well, why are you doing all this fashion and bands? And I'm like, great parties and beautiful women? She's like, no, seriously. I'm like, I'm 19 years old. This is a legitimate reason for a career path. So for 10 years, I followed that, traveling around the world, working with everyone from Lenny Kravitz to a very odd Mariah Carey and everything in between. But all the time, there was a sort of sense that it wasn't quite what I wanted to do. I was learning photography all the time. I learned how to use Studio Flash, how to print black and white, everything really. And I really wanted to use those skills to do something more important. But after 10 years of working as an editorial photographer, I had a nice lifestyle, a flat in London. It was very hard to make that change. And I used to think it was probably too late to make that change. Then one day, I kind of reached my tipping point. I was doing a shoot for a magazine for, I think it was GQ, and I'd always looked up to magazines like Esquire and GQ because they're really interesting people on the cover. And I thought, one day I'll get to do these portraits. By the time I was working for magazines like that, they were just doing celebrities from Big Brother or people I'd never even heard of. And I'd kind of, for me, had lost the interest. But because, as I say, I was caught up in that, I was doing those kind of pictures. And then this one particular occasion, we were at the Charlotte Street Hotel, and there was some contestant from Big Brother, and the editor was on the phone to me saying, tell her she's got to do it topless. And I'm like, I don't think she wants to do that. Oh, no, it's got to be done like that. It's got to be very sexy. And it just went on like this. And then she was saying she didn't want to do it. The editor's saying to me, I'll just tell her to fuck off then. I hope he's not here, by the way. And then I was just, this is it. This is not what I got into photography with. Now, the story is a little bit more rock and roll than the reality. The story that went around at the time was that I said, fuck it, that's it, I'm done, and threw all my cameras out the window of the Charlotte Street Hotel. The reality was a much more sort of minor hissy fit. I kind of went, I think I'm done. Threw them onto the bed. They promptly bounced out the bed, out the window. At that point, I'm kind of looking around going, yeah, of course I meant to do that. Trying to work out how you do the insurance claim when you get home. I'm an artist. I threw them out the window. So I gave up photography really at that stage. I moved out of London. I did a lot of different things. I did a bit of writing, ran across the Sahara, all your normal everyday things. And really, although I still had a kind of yearning to do photography, I thought, you know what, I've had a go at it. I was pretty lucky to have done some really exciting stuff with it. I can't see how now I completely can change the way I work, become a completely different photographer, and have the luck for it all to work out again. And I was also kind of bored of photography and just had lost my passion for it. So I ended up doing care work, which is pretty much the complete opposite of working in media. And I found myself looking after a young autistic boy. I was his sort of full-time carer. It was 24 hours a day, and I'd work 3 days a week and 3 days off. And he was really a lovely guy, and I worked with him for 2.5 years. We became very, very close friends. And bit by bit, talking to his family as well, we decided it'd be interesting to maybe document his life. And it came very organically. He was also excited about the idea. He liked photography and wanted me to take photographs of him. So on the days when I was working with him, I would borrow a camera and find myself just taking photographs. And one of the things I tried to explore was this sense of isolation he had. He always described his life as like living in a cellar, where you could hear this great party going on in the kitchen, and somehow you couldn't join the people. He was a very complex, interesting man, but as I say, caught. And one of the things he used to do was self-harm. he would punch himself in the face to get what he called the right feeling. And it's a very difficult thing to see. I remember the first time it happened, I was pretty distraught. His mother looked at me and said, "That's great, he trusts you now." I was like, "Oh, brilliant." You couldn't stop him from doing it. It was something you had to learn to do, was just to try and talk calmly to him. If you stopped him, he would actually become more violent, and if he accidentally hurt you, he would be distraught and hurt himself more. It was a very complex situation, so you just had to sit there calmly with him and just sort of suggest, well, maybe you shouldn't be doing that, or why don't you stop? But he wasn't getting the help he needed. Whenever we went to see counsellors and the sort of care team that was put in place to help him, we'd explain about how bad his self-harming was, and they would go, "Well, it can't be that bad." And really very little was being done about it. So it was decided that maybe I would try and take some photographs of him when he was actually self-harming, and we'd see if that would help to explain the situation to people. So I did. And the next meeting we had with a group of about 6 different people in his care team, when they were saying, well, we don't see much signs of self-harming, because it used to just leave a small one place he used to hurt. And they would go, well, it seems okay. And then we just produced this photograph. Immediately, the team was silent, and within a week, 2 weeks, miraculously, he had the care plan he needed. And in some small part, this photograph helped him, and at the moment, he's no longer self-harming. He has the support he needs to help him stop this. For me, though, it made me realize the power of photography as an advocate. I realized that taking images of situations of people who didn't have their own voice could be a really powerful tool, be a great way of helping people. I know it's a pretty obvious thing to do, and it took me a long time to come to that realization, but I did realize that I could use my photography as a document. So I set off to try and do that in other countries. I knew some people who worked at NGOs and United Nations in Angola, and so that's where I first set off. And my plan was to photograph the stories of people whose tales are not necessarily in the media, whose struggles are ongoing without timescales, and to try and record those stories. This was one of the first stories I did, and it's a very good example, I guess, of the kind of thing I mean. This was a story I was interested. I kind of sometimes look at newspapers or read stories, and you think, well, what's the missing gap? You might read about acid burns attacks in Pakistan and in India, and then your logic says, well, why don't I hear about it in Bangladesh? I assume it goes on there. So you inquire. One of the stories that interested me was everyone was doing stories on child soldiers and talking about child soldiers. And I actually had a friend that was working in Sierra Leone, looking after child soldiers, trying to and help them get back into society. And I remember thinking, well, what happens to those children when nobody helps them? The child soldiers that aren't rescued. So I set off in Angola to try and find people in prisoner of war camps that had been child soldiers that had never been saved, so to speak. So this was one of the pictures of a man who he wasn't sure where he was from. He wasn't actually sure of his age, but we think he was about 14 when he was taken from his village. The Angolan rebels had a great technique where they would come into the village. They would grab people, children. The children always knew about the guerrillas as the kind of bogeyman that lives in the jungle, so they were terrified. They would get the people, as in the case of this young man, they would get him to shoot a member of his own family. Because then when you take them back in the jungle, you say, well, you can't go back home now because you'll be killed for what you've done to somebody in your own family. So we're your family now. And it's a great psychological trick that works. So this man was now in his 30s, 40s, had been fighting for over 20 years in the Angolan rebels and had carried out many atrocities himself. People look at him and see the evil person that maybe he'd become. But I was interested in the fact that he, and many like him, were child soldiers. And I have to say, of all the people I've ever photographed in my life, they had the sort of blankest expressions you could ever imagine. So when I was in Angola, I was also kind of learning the style, because as I say, I hadn't done any documentary photography. It was something new to me. But I think I was taking in elements of the editorial work I'd done, of fashion photography, and trying to bring that into the work I was doing in the documentary style. When I was in Angola, I met a priest, a fantastic man who unfortunately was killed a couple of weeks after I met him by government forces. But he was a real character, and he kept saying to me, he was interested in photography, and he kept saying, I've got to take you to this abandoned church, well, abandoned school buildings and church, because there's a lot of widows of the war live there. He goes, but the light is amazing. And me trying to be the serious photojournalist was, yeah, but tell me about these women. You know, what's their stories? Oh, but the light, he goes, the light. Okay, but these women, why are they there? The light is so special. So eventually we turned up at this place, and I walked in, and I went, oh, the light. But this was an interesting story, because this is, again, I think one of the times when I learnt a lot about how to be a documentary photographer. When I first turned up at this place, the light stayed, but all the women ran away. They were widows of rebel soldiers who were terrified because the government forces had taken over the area. So they'd run away and hidden in these deserted buildings, and were living there as a sort of commune. And they'd never seen a white person. They didn't know if I was from the government, what I was there to do. So they just disappeared. I used to get so frustrated because I thought there's some great photographs here, but I can't take them. So day after day, I used to just go back and sit in the corner. And that's when I learned to be as boring as possible. I've learned it's one of the great skills I have, which I didn't know, was that I can bore pretty much anybody. Within a day or so, they forget I'm even in the room. So every day I would sit there, wait for them, bit by bit they would come, look. After a day or so, they go, he's the boring guy that sits in the corner, it's fine. And they would get on with their life. But for me, it was the first time I really experienced what it was like to be a documentary photographer. I don't believe a lot of photographers go to places, they rush in, take photographs, and then disappear. I even find the expression, to take a photograph is a strange expression. I always think a photograph should be given, and you have to earn the trust of the people that you're photographing. As you can see, the light was pretty amazing. So I would spend days and days photographing these people, earning their trust, and I realized that that's how I was going to take my best photographs. I'm now going to completely spoil the illusion of this image. I was taking the photograph, and I was thinking, oh, this is like a biblical scene, this is amazing, very evocative. And when people look at the picture, they see the women as they are, in this kind of very almost regal manner. But by this stage, they got so used to me, they had a new game. The game was, who can pinch the photographer on the arse when he's taking a picture? So every time I was looking at this picture going, oh, this is so beautiful, one of them would be sneaking out behind me, pinch me on the arse, and the rest of them would just burst into hysterics. This is many years later in a place called Kutupalong in Bangladesh on the border with Burma. It's a refugee camp, an unofficial refugee camp. If you look up at the top left, you can see just the edges of some more formal buildings. They're the official UN camp. The Bangladeshi government has never signed the refugee charter, is not very keen on letting the Rohingyas be helped here. So they allow the official camp to have a certain amount of people. Anybody outside of that, you're not allowed to help. So this camp literally lives in the sewerage of the main camp, and people who've been living there for over 20 years die of the most basic diseases. There was a young boy there, when I was there, got a bit of rice in his eye. He got infected, and he died a couple of weeks later, simply because he couldn't get to a hospital for antibiotics, and doctors are not allowed to go and visit those people. I wanted to document the stories because I thought it was important. I arranged with one of the village elders. I said, well, I'd like to come and do some portraits with a white background. We set up this little studio. I said, could you arrange tomorrow morning for a few people to come along for me to take their portraits? And he was very excited and very happy to do this. When I turned up in the morning, it was like a triage center. People had brought their sick and dying, and they were all laid out in front of this hut. Some of them moaning, all of them coming up to me and pointing their various ailments. People literally carrying down their sick and dying relatives. And I got in the middle of a panic, and I spoke to the village elder, and I said, you have to understand, I'm not a doctor. These people have to understand, I'm not a doctor. I can't help them. He looked at me, and he said, for 20 years we've been here. and nobody comes. They know you're not a doctor, but at least you can tell their stories. And for me, it was a moment of realizing the work I do is in some small way worthwhile. These stories should always be told and recorded. I came back to the UK with a story. I went to show a few magazines and people that have published my work before. I may not be the best photographer in the world, but I know my stuff's good enough to get published. All the editors I met would look through the story and they would go, okay, so this has been going on 20-something years. I'd be like, yes. And nothing's really happening. Like, yes. They're like, so what's the story? There's nothing going on and people dying. They look at me and they go, but what's the hook? There isn't one, that's the problem. And I realized I couldn't get these stories published. So at that point, I decided that I would never work with any magazines or be commissioned ever again. And my plan was just to go out and do work and do the stories that I thought were important, stories that should be documented. And I guess, went back into the tradition of a lot of early photography, which was to go out and just record things, not because you could make money from it or because there was somebody commissioning you to. So I actually went back to do care work. I got a job working 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. I actually got 2 people's jobs so I could work 7 days a week. Sort of sold my place, put everything I owned into storage, and I would work for a couple of months non-stop and then go away for a couple of months. Because I didn't want to be constrained by people telling me what to shoot, how to shoot it. I just wanted to take the pictures because I felt it was important. The first story I did like this, self-funded, was in Bangladesh. I did a story on acid burn survivors. The story there, again, the pictures were used more in advocacy than anything else. This particular photograph was helped in the court case of this woman. She had actually been attacked, I think at about the age of 12 or 13, because she wanted to carry on going to school and she kept rejecting a man that wanted to marry her. So the man threw acid on her face. Her family, unsure what to do, and in a country where it's very difficult for people to look after people who maybe have disabilities or reasons they can't work, the only option they saw was to force her to marry the man that had attacked her. And as he said to the family, well, nobody else will have her now, but I'll still have her. So she was forced to marry the man that had thrown acid on her face. 10 years later, she finally managed to run away and went to the Acid Burn Survivors Foundation in Bangladesh, where I met her and photographed her. And by recording her stories and a lot of the other people's stories is a way I've learned that you can actually help NGOs, you can help people in their own cases. And it's a really powerful tool and something that for me gives me far greater satisfaction than getting a photograph published in Vogue or in some advertising campaign. But it's not always easy. This is a photograph I took of a 12-year-old boy that had been shot in South Sudan. And he'd been shot through the stomach and the liver and the arm. And there was only one doctor there working for Médecins Sans Frontières, going through a lot of people, a lot of child soldiers that had been injured in this particular round of fighting. And there was very little he could do for this boy, so he had to walk on, leaving this boy on his own in a hut. And I was left there, stood there, with the decision, do you take his photograph? Well, in my mind, the photograph was important. It was a picture to tell the story of what happened there. I took a couple of frames, then sat with the boy for the rest of the day. But I think no matter what reason you go there to take a photograph or why you're there, in your mind you think you're there for all the right reasons. When you take a photograph like that, if it doesn't haunt you, there's something wrong with you. And if you don't feel like a vulture or something wrong, then again, there's something wrong with you. So that evening, I sat down with the doctor, Dr. Murray, who's an Australian doctor working there, and I said to him, I don't think I can do it anymore. I said, I took that photograph today and I felt like the devil. I said, I see you there patching people up, actually doing something practical, and I'm just useless. And he looked at me and he goes, I was brought up in the Australian outback and we had no TV, very little. He goes, all I used to see was really old copies of things like National Geographic and odd Sunday magazine supplements. But looking through those pictures, I was inspired as a young child to become a doctor, to go work in places like this, to try and make some difference. And I can't say I felt much better at that particular time, But it did make me realize that we can all be cogs in the wheel of change, that we can all make a difference in some small way. We're not all doctors, we're not all politicians, we don't all have the financing to do things, but we can all do something. I found my tool is photography. I can travel, I can tell other people's stories, I can point my camera in the right direction. But other people can do things like raise funds or just write letters. But the point is, we can all and should all make some kind of change. This was another photograph I did when I was in South Sudan, and I put this as an example of how I try and take photographs. I don't like to make people victims. I don't believe people are victims as such, but victims of circumstance. This was a young woman who had come in. She'd walked to Medicine Sans Frontières compound because she knew she was having problems in childbirth. Unfortunately, this is the exact moment when her child died as she was giving birth to it. The scene was pretty unpleasant. I won't go into the details of what happened after that, but it was one of the most horrific things I've seen. And as a photographer, you have a choice. I could have taken a picture of the whole event. I could have focused on other parts and really could have put a photograph up here that would shock you and make you sick. But I always think if somebody ever says they've looked at one of my photographs, or they say they saw one of my photographs but they had to look away, then I think I've failed. The whole point for me of a photograph is to draw people in so that they learn more about the story. So I think that the thing I try and do is, even in the most horrific circumstance, try and focus on the individual, try and let them retain their dignity, and try and let them tell their story in a way that they'd want it to be told. I guess this was all put to the proof and the test for me 18 months ago. I was working in Afghanistan, embedded with a small group of American soldiers. We'd gone on an early morning patrol from a place where we'd been ambushed a couple of times to check out the compound. As we were waiting outside the compound, I turned to talk to one of the American soldiers, and as I did, I stepped on an IED. That's me lying there, being tended to. I remember at that point I was looking up at the tree and I could see bits of my boxer shorts, and I was thinking, that's not a good sign. Luckily, I had some great doctors, or field medics that were there. They got the tourniquets on me, and within about 10 minutes, I was on a medevac helicopter on the way back to Kandahar. But obviously, I'd lost both my legs and my left arm. Yet it's weird, at that moment, I remember thinking to myself, I can still see, I've still got my right hand, and thinking I can still take photographs. Little sort of side story on this photograph. There was a Canadian photographer embedded with the medevac crew by coincidence that picked me up, and he took these pictures. Obviously, I didn't know about it because after I got back to the UK, I slipped into a coma for nearly 2 months. My family wasn't sure about whether to tell me these photographs had been taken. They had appeared in the New York Times, and they were worried that I might find it a bit upsetting. But being a real photographer, finally, they showed me this picture, and I can honestly say, I just looked at it and went, well, I wouldn't have cropped it like that. I mean, seriously. But when I was lying in my hospital bed, I thought about what came next for me. I knew I wanted to get back taking photographs. I realized that one of my great skills is not as a creative, but as somebody who has empathy for people. And I realized that for the first time, my empathy would be almost on an equal level with the people that have gone through experiences like mine. I actually, weird as it may sound to people, got quite excited about my future. A lot of people think, how could you be excited about your future? Well, you can't look at the negatives, you can't look at the bad things that have happened. You have to look at the things that got better. And I'm excited. I'm excited to go back and take photographs of people that have gone through experiences like mine, because I realize my understanding and my position of telling their story is greater than ever. I mean, you worry, I think if you go to places, conflict zones and humanitarian areas, you really have to be at the top of your game. And part of me has questioned, could I still do what I did? Obviously, I'm not as mobile, I'm not as agile, but I do genuinely believe that I have qualities now as a photographer that I didn't have before. Certainly as a man, I'm a better person, I'm more focused, reliable. And so you realize that, when things happen that maybe are negative, that you think hold you back in your career, those constraints can often be the things that bring you the most reward in terms of your creativity. One of the things I wanted to do first was take a self-portrait. Everyone was saying to me when you're in hospital, you should take pictures of everything. Now, it didn't really interest me, but I did want to show myself as I saw myself, and I thought it was really important. I was thinking of Greek and Roman statues that I used to see when I was a kid, and that when you see a Roman statue that's lost an arm, or a Greek statue that's broken, nobody looks at that and says, well, it's broken, it's no good. They still see the beauty that is there, the strength of that sculpture for what it is. And so I wanted to create an image of myself in that way. And so this was the first photograph I took. I was still, actually at this point, still in a wheelchair, still in and out of operations. And I went to a friend's studio and we set this picture up so I could take a self-portrait. And I hope it achieved the goal that I wanted, which is to say, I'm still here, I'm still the same, and I hope I captured myself in the way that I want to capture others. I wanted to show that you can still be defiant and there's nothing to stop you doing what you want to do. I'd say this afternoon, I'm getting on a plane and going to Kenya. The first time I've gone abroad properly since this happened. But it just shows you can do anything. Anyway, that's my talk. Thank you.